Ever since I posted my miniature worlds animation, I've had a crazy number of requests to make a follow-up video. I don't think any other video has been so requested on this channel before. Since it is December and so many people said it reminds them of a snow globe, I thought it'd be fun to put a nice little Christmas spin on things. This video has been sponsored by Nvidia and Scan. We'll talk more about that later, but right now let's just jump in and take a look at how I made this snow globe miniature world. So the first scene I did was an English style cottage. I thought we'd mix things up here by going for an American house in the neo-colonial style. Generally speaking, houses have walls, and this style of house usually has wood panelling. I made the wood panelling by creating a plane and scaling it so it was roughly the right size. Then I just added a few loop cuts and I beveled them slightly. Then I extruded in the beveled faces to make that little bit of a gap in between each plank of wood. Then I could just take that piece and copy it and rotate it into place, then resize it to make all the other walls. Once all of the walls were in place, I just quickly modelled out some windows and I placed them in the right spots. Now obviously the windows needed to be slightly recessed into the walls, so I just used a boolean to cut out the hole for the windows. There's an add-on that comes with Blender called the Bool tool. Using the Bool tool you can just select your cutter object, shift select the wall, and then you can press Ctrl and number pad minus and it'll cut that object straight out of the wall. I added some simple cubes to make the interior spaces of the house. You can fake the background of a window with just an image plane or even just a texture, and people often do that, but I think it adds a really nice touch if you can actually see into the windows and there's something going on behind the glass. To make the glass look like it was all iced over and frosty, I just took a noise modifier and I plugged that into the roughness slot of the glass material. That did work okay, but I actually changed that up later on in the video. Whenever I make glass windows, I like to add a musgrave texture and I plug that into the bump. That just adds a little bit of a warble to the glass, like the panes aren't perfectly flat. You see that quite often in real life, especially with single glazed windows on old buildings. Since I didn't really fancy modelling the entire interior of this house, I needed a way to kind of obscure what was behind the glass a little bit. I modelled out a really basic curtain and I used the cloth sim with a collision object just to get a nice sort of slightly random shape. To make the net material for the curtains, I mixed the principal shader with a little bit of translucency, and then I mixed that together with a transparent shader. A magic node was used as the factor of that mix node. You might not have seen the magic node before, it's a little bit obscure, it's not used very often, but it makes these really nice repeating patterns. It comes in very handy sometimes if you want to make a material look like it has a much more complex pattern than it actually has. I didn't bother modelling out a proper door for the house, I just used one from the Archimesh add-on. Archimesh comes with Blender, you just have to enable it in the add-on menu. It has lots of really nice architectural elements like doors, windows and stairs. It even comes with some little pieces of furniture. It also has a lot of nice options for different accessories too, like you can change the style of the windows or the type of door handles. So next I made a basic snow shader, and if we get two materials and we plug them into a mix shader, we can transition between them, right? But what we need is a mask to make sure that the snow only goes on top of objects. We can do that really easily by taking the coordinate node and plugging the normal output into a separate XYZ node. Then if we take just the Z output, we can get just the top of the objects. You can run that through a colour ramp first or a map range node to really dial in the look and decide exactly how much of the top you want to be covered. You can also add this whole setup to a node group, and then you can just add that to any material in your scene and it'll give each material a nice little layer of top snow. Now this method worked really well just to add a light dusting of snow to some objects, but I also wanted most of the objects to be covered in a much thicker layer of snow. To do this, I used a really nice little add-on called Real Snow. Once again, that comes with Blender, you just have to enable it in the preferences. With Real Snow, you can just select an object, choose the different snow settings that you want and hit generate. It'll add this snow mesh on top of the object complete with the snow material. As a little word of warning, the snow meshes that it creates are quite dense in terms of how many polygons they have, and it does use some displacement too. So if you have a really slow computer, you might not want to try and make a scene that has a lot of snow using this add-on. So next I just went around the scene and I added in a bunch of little details like the fence that goes on top of the porch. I used this really nice dark blue colour for the accent paint around the windows and the doors. I actually changed that later on for the final render, and looking at this now, I think that was probably a mistake because I really quite like this colour, but there's nothing I can do to change that now. One little trick that you can see me doing here is to add a Rigify human armature as just a scale guide. The default is a little bit tall, I think it's about 2 meters, so I always scale that down to 92% scale because I know that's the exact same height as me, so it'll be a really good scale reference. Whenever you're working on more complex scenes, especially if you've got lots of small light sources like this, things tend to get very noisy very fast. That's a real problem when you're trying to make small changes to materials because you have to wait a long time for the viewport to resolve, which slows down your workflow. Since I've got an Nvidia RTX graphics card, I like to turn on the optics viewport denoiser, which is incredibly fast. It allows me to get a more accurate idea of the changes that I'm making in real time. It's even fast enough that I can actually model in rendered view and it'll just denoise everything while I work. I thought it would be nice to add a wreath onto the door. I didn't spend a whole lot of time on this, I just made this quick twig shape. I did that by extruding out a couple of verts so I had edges in the shape of a twig. And then I used the skin modifier just to give that some thickness. By default that'll look way too thick, but if you go into edit mode and select everything, you can scale it all down by using Ctrl and A. Once the twig was finished, I created this circular object and I gave it a particle system. I used the twig as the particle object. It obviously looked terrible at first, but if you just play around with the random rotation and the scale, you'll get something that looks quite a lot like a Christmas wreath. There's quite a few methods for making nice ribbon bows, but they're all a bit long-winded and I didn't want to spend that much time on something that's basically a background element. I tried to just quickly model one out by extruding a plane and adding a subdivision modifier to it, but to be honest I thought that looked a bit shit, so I deleted it. Looking at it back now, it wasn't really that bad, it probably could have stayed, but once again, it's too late for that. Looking at reference images of neo-colonial houses, I noticed that quite a lot of the time they have these nice brick chimneys. Brickwork can be a little bit tricky in CGI because it often just looks too flat and unconvincing. To break up the flatness a little bit, I just added some loop cuts to the whole thing and I gave it a displacement modifier just to add some irregularities. It didn't really have to look perfect since I knew it would be kind of in the background of the shot and it would be in the shadows, and in the final render it looks okay. Those nice little wobbly bricks down the side can really go a long way. As an added benefit, since the geometry now isn't flat, there's some faces that are pointing up, I can add the snow node group that I made earlier on, and that'll add a little bit of snow caught on the bricks. I'll be uploading a more advanced version of this node group to my Patreon sometime this week. Speaking of Patreon materials, I also used the terracotta material node group that I made for Patreon a while back for the chimney pots. I actually made that just as a one-off, but I end up using that quite often. So next up, we need a little bit of smoke coming out the chimney. I separated out the bottom of the chimney pots to their own material, and I used a smoke emitter on that. I just pressed F3 and searched for quick smoke, and that adds a simple smoke effect. There's quite a lot of smoke tutorials online for Blender, so I won't go into depth about that. Fluid simulations in Blender are painful at the best of times. It takes a hell of a lot of trial and error just to get something that looks like a passable result. Now that wouldn't normally be too bad, except it's also very slow. So you have to tweak a setting, wait ages for it to bake, realise that it looks terrible, tweak another setting, rinse and repeat until you go mad. But eventually, after quite a while, in this case 30 minutes I think the recording part for this was, you get something that looks kind of like a passable result. So I got there in the end, and I used a wind modifier just to add a little bit of crosswind to the effect. A nice little trick here is to keyframe the wind strength, then open up the graph editor, add a noise modifier to that keyframe. Then you can modulate the strength of the wind so that will constantly change and it'll have a different effect all the time on the smoke. If you allow the noise to go into negative numbers, it'll also occasionally make it look like the wind is blowing the opposite direction. When you're making an environment animation like this, anything you can do to add a little bit of life is really going to help to sell things. I was going to just add some birds into the shot at first, but then I remembered that scene from Home Alone where Kevin uses the fake people to make it look like people are in the house. So I just did the same thing here. I grabbed an animated character from Mixamo and I placed her in the front room so that she'd walk past the window right as the camera pulled back. Even after adding this lady into the window, I thought that the windows looked a little bit empty. It looked kind of like this was an abandoned house. I figured I could help that out by adding some actual curtains behind the netting, so I just added another quick cloth simulation under a plane, and I modelled this really basic like curtain tie object that would move into the cloth as the simulation was running to act as a pullback. To make things look a little bit more Christmassy, I decided to add some fairy lights. I'm going to show you how I made this procedural fairy light system, but first I just want to give a quick shout out to Nvidia and Scan for sponsoring this video. You might not know that Nvidia has a program called RTX Studio which certifies devices aimed at creative uses like Blender, Photoshop and Premiere. Not only do RTX Studio devices have to match a strict set of criteria in terms of specs, but Nvidia also tests each device to make sure that it's worthy of the Studio program name and that you'll get really good results for any sort of creative workflow. Scan has an excellent range of RTX Studio devices available, both laptops and desktop systems. I've personally used and trusted Scan for well over a decade to buy all sorts of equipment and they've never disappointed. Check out the link in the description to see Scan's whole range of RTX Studio devices. Right, so let's talk about how I made that fairy light thing. First, we're going to need a curve object to control the placement of the lights. Then we're going to add a low poly cylinder. I think I used 10 sides on this. That's going to act as the actual wire. I scaled down the cylinder to roughly match the length of the curve, and then I just added about 10 loop cuts. I moved the whole thing up so it was just above the origin, and then I made a duplicate that was just below the origin. Next I added the simple deform modifier, set to twist mode and 360 degrees. If we give this an array modifier now, we can increase the count of that and it'll just keep repeating. I'm going to set the array to fit curve and I'm going to select the curve object that I made earlier. Now the array count will continually increase to match the length of the curve, but it doesn't actually follow the shape of the curve. To do that, all we need to do is add a curve modifier and select the curve object, and now what should happen is whenever we extrude out part of the curve, the wire mesh should follow along with it. If we want to control the twisting of the wire, we can also select one point, turn on proportional editing, then use Ctrl and T to twist the wire. Now we just need to go back into edit mode for the actual wire object itself and add a few simple bulb objects. Select the top of the bulb and give that an emission material to make it light up. For a little bit of extra decoration and to have something to hang these fairy lights on, I decided to add a Christmas tree into the yard. To do this, I just used the Botanic add-on. If you've watched my videos before, you've probably seen me use this add-on because I do use it quite often. One of the cool things about Botanic is that you can search for trees by season, and if you get one of the winter trees, they quite often have a layer of snow already on them. They also have preset animations for wind, although I think I actually removed the wind animation for the final render. I'll leave a link to Botanic in the description. So I used the same basic fairy light object for the tree dressing, but I thought it would look cool to add some blinking lights. I did this by connecting a wave modifier to the color ramp of the emission material and I set that to constant mode. Now if I offset the phase, it'll make the lights turn off and on as the wave goes through the emission material. Instead of keyframing this property, I just used a simple driver. If you type in #frame into Blender, then the number will increase for every frame. If that's too fast, you can also add a slash and then divide it by that amount. So for instance, if you type #frame/2, then the number will increase by 0.5 for every frame in the animation. So we can plug this straight into the emission slot of the principal shader to make the lights turn on and off, or we can set the color ramp to different colors and we'll get all sorts of different effects. I found that trying to manually hang all of these lights was a little bit of a chore, so an easier method is to delete all of the control points for the curve and then press T to open up the tool panel and select the draw tool. Now if we press N to go into the active tool settings, we can make sure that the draw mode is set to surface. Now you can just draw the curve straight onto any mesh in the scene and the lights will automatically be added to it. I found that this was a nice way to make some more complex patterns without having to mess around with curve placements. Now that the house is complete, I knew that I would need to make a ground, so I did that just by adding in a plane and subdividing it about 60 times, then I gave it a couple of levels of subdivision with a subdiv modifier. I gave that a new material and an image texture, and in the texture paint tools I drew out where I'd want there to be a path and any other areas of interest, like around the front window I knew I wanted there to be a snowman, and obviously the ground would be a little bit disturbed too underneath the tree. I also quickly went into sculpt mode and I just added a little bit of snow drift around the areas where the snow would naturally build up, like around the corners. So I saved out the image texture I made for the ground and I took that into Photoshop. I created a custom brush for some footprints and I used that just to draw out the pattern of some footsteps. Then I loaded that image into Blender as a displacement map. With displacement, dark values are pushed down and light values are pushed up. So by drawing out some black footsteps and adding a little bit of light around them, some white areas, you can make it look like someone's been walking in the snow. Right, so I mentioned earlier that I made a snowman, so let's talk about how I did that because it was fairly simple. I just made two spheres that were roughly the size of the proportions for the snowman, then I joined those two together so there'd be one mesh, took that into the sculpt mode and I used the remesher just to make it all one piece of geometry with a bit more resolution. Sculpting out a snowman was pretty hard to mess up, to be honest. We aren't exactly recreating Michelangelo's David here, it's just a snow statue shaped by a small child who's likely wearing mittens. Blender comes with this nice little rock generator add-on and I used that to make some pieces of coal just to decorate the snowman. Then once all that was done, I created a sphere to act as the dome that would go around the whole thing. I used the build tool again just to cut out a disc from the ground plane. I also used a boolean here just to cut out the area that wasn't going to be visible because it's underneath the house. This ground plane has quite a lot of levels of subdivision, so anything we can do to reduce the poly count is going to be worth it. Adding some falling snow into the scene was fairly easy too. I just made a duplicate of that dome object that I made. I scaled it down slightly and then I trimmed it off so it was just the top part. I gave this object a particle system and then I created a little snow object that would act as the particle. You can see me using a plane for it here at first with a little bit of subdivision, but I actually swapped that for an icosphere later on. Then I made a duplicate of the house and any of the other large objects and I joined those all together and gave them a collision property. In the particle system settings, I made sure that I selected die on hit. What that does is it removes the particle once it hits a collider. That's really important here because otherwise you would get some snowflakes that appear in the areas where they shouldn't exist, like inside the house or underneath the porch. Once I'd baked out the particle system, I could just remove that copy with the collision object and I would just be left with the remaining house, but none of the snow would go inside. I added another sphere into the scene and I gave it a volumetric material to simulate a little bit of dense air, kind of like fog. Volumetrics are really important to get a more realistic look, but they're also incredibly noisy, which leads to longer render times. The latest generation of RTX GPUs from Nvidia have some tricks up their sleeve to deal with volumetrics, and when you combine that with the optics denoising and Cycles X, you can get really reasonable render times even with lots of dense volumetrics in the scene. I used to avoid volumetrics wherever it was possible because the render times were just too huge, but these days the combination of the RTX power that I've got and Cycles X basically means that I can use volumetrics in every scene. I rendered out this project with quite a few different layers so that I could have more control over what was happening. For instance, I wanted motion blur on the snowflakes but not on the rest of the scene. Luckily, Nvidia has this fantastic GPU accelerated motion blur that's built into Blender for newer RTX cards. Even though I had tens of thousands of blurred particles here, it rendered out really quickly. And the last part was just some finishing touches. I added a few more plants using the Botanic add-on into the garden, and I also used the Real Snow add-on to give them just a bit of a dusting of snow. I added a few berries onto the wreath, although that wasn't really visible in the final render, and I also added some baubles under the tree. The baubles couldn't have been simpler. I just modified a sphere so it had the basic shape of a bauble, and then I used a wave modifier plugged into the roughness of the material to give the bauble a nice little striped pattern. I mixed up a few different colours with the colour ramp and plugged that in as the base colour, and then I used the random output of object info node as the factor. That just gives every single duplicate of the bauble a different random shade of the colour. I placed all the baubles under the tree using a particle system. I just moved the origin of the bauble so it'd be at the top of the mesh, and then I selected the tree object, and in edit mode I just selected all of the main branches of the tree where I wanted the particles to hang from. I added those to a vertex group, then I gave the tree a particle system and I used the bauble as the particle object. Now we get the particles all over the tree. To make sure that they only grow from the branches, I selected the vertex group that I just made as the density of the particles, so now the baubles only appear where we want them to be. So with all that done, it was time for the final render. I'm really glad that I rendered out everything in separate passes here because this was a horrible experience. Everything went wrong with the rendering. To bring down the render times, I often use something called persistent data. That basically forces Blender to keep a hold of certain information in between frames. Instead of trying to build the scene from scratch every time, it'll keep a hold of some of the information I just used. It can be a really big time saver on complex scenes, but it's incredibly buggy for some reason, and it seems to get very easily confused about what should be happening from frame to frame. So on some frames, certain objects just appeared black for no reason. On some frames, one or two of the lights inside the house would just randomly turn off. I had this really weird issue where some of the lights seemed to slowly just fall down from the fairy lights. I have no idea why or how that could happen. I didn't even bother to fix this part, to be honest. It's still in the final render because it would have been a pain to fix, and it's pretty small, isn't it? I thought I finally had this thing fixed when I realised that there was no smoke in the scene. It was supposed to be added into the main pass, but for some reason, if I rendered out a single frame, the smoke would be there, but if I rendered out a series of frames for an animation, it wasn't there. So I just had to render out the smoke as a separate pass, and I composited that back on top as well. Overall, I'm pretty happy with how this thing turned out. I didn't spend too much time on this, and a lot of that time was spent troubleshooting all the issues I had, especially at the end, but I think the final animation came out pretty nice. It was quite close to what I had in mind when I started. Thank you very much for watching this video, and thank you to Scan and Nvidia for sponsoring it. Remember to check out the link in the description so you can see Scan's whole range of RTX Studio devices.